busy weekend as we try and unpack and the key takeaways there. What stood out to you the most, sir?
Well, I think the first takeaway, of course, is the completely differing perspectives. China's perspective is also, much closer to the impact, if you like. It's on its periphery, whereas the American impact, of course, is from long distance. The perspective is further away, and I think that from Beijing always makes the American view difficult to take. And I think that Beijing sees that the Americans are creating instability, whereas the Chinese believe they're creating stability, and that's the basic differences.
Okay, maybe Digby, follow up on that then. Do you think that the fact that these defense ministers are meeting from both sides, I mean, there's been so much scrutiny about why we're not getting, these defense talks underway, and now we're finally seeing a little bit of that conversation at least. Does that put us more in terms of a more, stabilizing relations between the U.S. and China?
Definitely, in relation to the military to military communications, that's been going now for at least a few months, and that's a really good step forward. However, all the essential problems exist. But yes, you're right. Communications is always going to be dialogue, and that's exactly what the Chinese have always been asking for, and what they continue to ask for. And I think that's their primary concern, is to ensure dialogue and not actions. So U.S. actions, unilateral, say seen as unilateral, and then some kind of dialogue after the provocation has been made. So this is always essentially still going to rub China the wrong way.
China's trying to mitigate its political risk by reaching out to other places in the world. I know you've done some work on China's efforts to bring the Middle East and increase its footprint there. Tell us about what you're seeing there, Digby.
Well, what I'm seeing in the Middle East and West Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean is problems. The last thing in the Belt and Road needs to complete the Afro-Eurasian connection is the roads through Iraq and Syria to Israel, to the Red Sea, the mouth of the Red Sea, and this is where you see the conflict. But the BRICS Plus, I think, is now stabilising that whole Red Sea area. And I was just I just did a keynote speech in Beijing a couple of days ago, where I had ambassadors from all of those regions, Somalia and Eritrea, Saudi, so forth. And look, they're seeing a stabilising factor in the BRICS Plus, and I think China is having a large effect there. Russia is also active in the area. The Turks are active in the area, and I think they all want to stabilise that. They don't want to see these problems in the Ukraine, in Gaza, in Taiwan. They don't want to see that going, crazy into Africa and across the Red Sea, and that's basically a stabilising factor. And I think Iran and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Ethiopia, who had conflict before, and they're now settling those water problems. Look, that's actually a positive outlook on the Red Sea in general, but of course the Gaza-Israel situation is still going to be very difficult.
And what does this mean for, the South China Sea, also when it comes to Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait? I want to throw some sound first. We heard from the defense minister in China, Dong Zhen, talking a little bit more about the situation in Taiwan. Let's listen to him on that first.
The Chinese People's Liberation Army will remain a strong force for upholding national reunification. We will take resolute actions to curb Taiwan independence and make sure such a plot never succeeds. Anyone who dares to separate Taiwan from China will only end up in self-destruction.
It's similar rhetoric we've heard before, Digby, but certainly, it does raise the question. After less than 2 weeks ago, we saw these large-scale military exercises around the Taiwan Strait from China. Are we closer to some sort of conflict in the Taiwan Strait, or should we be looking elsewhere, like the South China Sea, more?
No, I don't think we're looking at conflict. I think that's just using the word conflict is kind of changing the context too far towards the red lines. No, I mean, these are just really consistent positions in real terms, and they're being stated slightly more vociferously, with more strength, but the essential situation is exactly the same. Now, in terms of the naval movements around and the air movements of China around Taiwan, I mean, they're just demonstrating capability. That's the key part here. But the actual position is not the same. And as we said at the beginning, at the top end of the show, the dialogue between the military, both militaries, and especially in a context of the American-US election. So there's some manipulation of public opinion going on here. Conflict is not the right way to look at this. It's definitely a continuation and a heightening of this because it feeds public opinion, especially in election cycles. But the reality is that China's capabilities are growing and America's capabilities are not growing.
Digby, just to bring you back in, but let's shift the topic to Ukraine. And President Zelensky was in Singapore. He made that appearance there. I think he tried to gather in support from the region for the conference they have in Switzerland, I believe, mid of June, that might be able to lay out for us a path towards an end to this war. Doesn't seem China's going to be attending that as well. How big of a challenge does that become then in achieving an end, at least a map towards an end to the war in Ukraine, Digby?
Yeah, look, China's policy, well, in relation to the peace talks, the Swiss peace talks, look, China has open channels to Switzerland, evidently, and look, they're not going to attend because it doesn't include Russia and Ukraine. That's very, very simple. Those parties have to be there, and they have to be included. And until that happens, there's not going to be any peace talks. But China definitely wants it to happen, and they've released a 6-point statement with the Brazilians. But this is basically, and that statement was about non-escalation, so on the battlefield, supply of weapons, etc. And I think that position seems, and my friend at Quant Analysis, I think, will agree with this. Is until that happens, risk is going to remain higher. But look, I think China's trying to mediate, and they've definitely got a much stronger position for mediation than the US or the EU, the NATO countries, who have a stake in the war, in fact. So, China's position, I think, is a more balanced one, and I think that the global South, generally global majority, is also going to follow that, and that's an important part that they understand now, in a real sense, that the US has kind of a real, they're sitting on the fence, so they're trying to face one way and then face the other way, but at the end of the day, China's stake is much, much lower, and they're going to be able to be more helpful in mediation eventually.